Hello, I'm Mark Arnold from Urban Saints, and in this series of videos we've been exploring the topic of disability equality. In this video we're looking more closely at the Equality Act 2010 and understanding more about what that requires of us and informs us about disability equality. There's a lot to cover as we go through the various aspects of the Equality Act, and so we've got some examples of how perhaps this can be applied in different settings. Hopefully some of that will be helpful for you as you unpack that in your own context. The Equality Act of 2010 legally protects people from discrimination in the workplace and in wider society. It replaces previous anti-discrimination laws and brings it all together into a single act, making the law easier to understand and indeed to implement, and strengthening protection in some situations. It sets out the different ways in which it's unlawful to treat somebody. Before the Equality Act of 2010 came into force, there were several pieces of legislation that protected people from discrimination, including the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995. All of these now combine into the Equality Act of 2010 and have providing better levels of protection, particularly for people with disability. There are several kinds of disability discrimination, and we're going to be exploring each of them in turn. The first of these is direct discrimination. And within the direct discrimination definition, there are three different subcategories that we'll be looking at as we work our way through it. In each of them, we'll look at providing an example of what that can look like so that you can explore this in your own context. So, first of all, actual direct discrimination, where somebody receives less favourable treatment than others because of a protected characteristic, perhaps because of their disability. So, for example, if somebody who has an intellectual or learning disability is prevented from entering a cinema to go and see a film because the staff at the cinema perceive that that person might make some noise or they consider that that person might be disruptive, even if there's no evidence to suggest that will be the case, that person has been discriminated against. Associative discrimination. Now, this is similar to direct discrimination, but applies to somebody who is discriminated against because of their association with a disabled person. So, for example, if a family were going for a meal at a pub restaurant, but they were prevented from going in and ordering their meal because they have a son who's autistic, and the staff at the pub felt that the young man might be disruptive in some way, then he himself would have been directly discriminated against because of his disability, but also his family would have been discriminated against in an associative way because they were with him at that time and were also unable to participate in what they had hoped to do. Perceptive discrimination. Perceptive discrimination is when somebody is directly discriminated against because there is a perception that they might have a protected characteristic, for example, a disability. In other words, people believe that they are disabled and therefore discriminate against them on the basis of that perception. An example might be that somebody who has a short-term physical injury tries to book on a walking holiday and is discriminated against and told that no, they can't book on the walking holiday. And the perception is that they're disabled and that they wouldn't be able to participate. Well, they would have been directly discriminated against as a result of that. Even though they aren't actually disabled, they are being discriminated against because it's perceived that they are disabled. And there is just as much strength in the law to protect people who are perceived to be disabled as disabled people themselves. Now, there are a range of protections that are provided that extend beyond disability to cover people with mental health conditions as well. Some mental health conditions are classified as disabilities, and examples include depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar affective disorder. And a person who has one of those conditions is protected against from direct discrimination in just the same way as anybody with any other form of disability. Having explored the three different kinds of direct discrimination, we're now going to have a look at the different forms of indirect discrimination as well. There are two chief areas of indirect discrimination that we can explore. One is group discrimination. This is where a group of people who, for example, share a disability are potentially indirectly discriminated against by being put at a collective disadvantage. An example of this might be if a church runs some events on the second floor of a building that has no lift, then they will have potentially indirectly discriminated against people who have a mobility disability and are unable to climb stairs. Now that can be a whole group of people rather than a specific individual, and hence it falls under indirect discrimination rather than direct discrimination. Another area of indirect discrimination is particular disadvantage. Particular disadvantage is where there is the potential for indirect discrimination against a specific person with a particular disability, putting them at a distinct disadvantage to others. An example might be that some autistic people might find loud noise difficult to cope with. Playing loud music in a clothing store could potentially indirectly discriminate against autistic people who struggle with loud noise. Whilst direct discrimination can't be challenged, indirect discrimination can sometimes be challenged. It is possible to justify indirect discrimination if there are other factors that perhaps can be considered to be more significant. It might be, for example, that there are some health and safety concerns about somebody with a physical disability taking part in certain activities. And therefore, it is possible to indirectly discriminate against a bunch of people with a particular disability if those health and safety concerns are considered to be more significant. Taking the example that we looked at of indirect discrimination against people with a particular disadvantage by being autistic and not being able to cope very well with loud noise in a shop, it might be possible for the people running the shop to say, well, actually, this is a high fashion shop for young people. It's expected that there will be loud music in a shop like that. And we provide ways for people who struggle with loud noise to be able to view clothes in a quieter area of the shop. And therefore they've put some things in place to mitigate the indirect discrimination that might be happening. So there are ways that it's possible to evaluate whether indirect discrimination has actually happened and indeed whether there is justification for that. Finally, there is discrimination arising from a disability. Now, discrimination that arises from a disability is because of unfavourable treatment that somebody has received that arises as a consequence of them having a disability. It's not specifically related to them being directly discriminated against because of their disability. An example might be a youth group who choose to go on a holiday, and the leaders of the youth group make it a condition of being able to go on the holiday that members of the youth group need to have attended 75% of all of the group's sessions and activities during that year. Now, for a young person who has a disability, maybe they have hospital visits, maybe there are times when they're not well enough to be able to visit the group, and their attendance might be below that 75% threshold. They can be able to claim that they've been discriminated against arising from their disability if their condition hasn't been taken into account when setting that threshold. So it might be that for their peers, that 75% threshold is appropriate, but for them, a lower threshold might be more applicable. Reasonable adjustments. There is a duty under the Equality Act 2010 for organisations to make adjustments if their standard provision, practice or criteria put someone with protected characteristics such as disability at a substantial disadvantage compared with somebody who doesn't have those particular protected characteristics. So, for example, if a disabled person is put at a substantial disadvantage compared to somebody who is not disabled as a consequence of there not being disabled toilets or a changing room at a particular venue, that would be an area where perhaps a reasonable adjustment could be made. Reasonable adjustments are adjustments that can be put in place to mitigate, remove and address any barriers or issues that might be resulting in discrimination potentially against somebody who's participating in that activity or attending that particular event. So an example might be that if there is a venue that doesn't have a disabled toilet or a changing room, providing that could be a reasonable adjustment that might assist people with a disability to be able to participate in what goes on in that venue. There are a range of things that can be considered when looking at reasonable adjustments that need to be made to see how appropriate those reasonable adjustments might be. Financial and other resources available. Are these limited? Is there a limited budget that would be blown out of the water by putting this particular adjustment in place? What's the cost of the adjustment? Is it financially prohibitive? In my day job, looking at areas of children's and youth work, we run camps and holidays. And a reasonable adjustment at one camp that we were running was to provide a disabled toilet and changing place for a young person that needed it. The disabled toilet and changing place that they were looking for was prohibitively expensive. But we were able to find a more affordable solution that still provided what they needed, and we were able to compromise on the solution that was put in place. Would the adjustment avoid the disadvantage? Will it help? Will it actually make a difference? Or is the difference that it would make so minimal that it really still leaves that person unable to be able to participate in whatever it is that we're providing as part of that venue? What's the effect of the disadvantage on that individual? Is the disadvantage that's being provided by the venue or the activity or whatever it is that is potentially causing them a disadvantage, is it significant? And are there other ways that we could support them and explore ways in which they could engage with what we're doing? And finally, as we looked at earlier, are there any other areas of compliance such as health and safety that we need to consider that may ultimately prove to be more significant and therefore prevent us from making that particular reasonable adjustment to support that particular individual? Anticipatory duty in providing services. As the name anticipatory suggests, there is a requirement under the Equality Act of 2010 for us to consider and put in place things that are going to remove barriers to people being included in the things that we do. In other words, making sure that anybody with any of the protected characteristics, including disability, are not discriminated against when they arrive. It's not appropriate for us to wait until somebody arrives and turns up and points out to us that they are being discriminated against before we then start to do something. Now clearly we can't think of every single possible way that somebody could be discriminated against, but we could explore some of the ways in which perhaps there are more obvious potential discriminatory areas, things for us to have a look at. So we could look at, for example, physical access. Are we able to get into the building, move around a building, be able to get from place to place, get to where meetings are going to be happening, get from one floor to another if that's the way that the building works. Are we able to ensure that people who perhaps have who are deaf or are blind are able to access what we're doing in meetings? So is there a signer that could be available if somebody requires that, or could there be large print versions of presentations that somebody could use to enable them to engage with what's happening on a projection screen? Are people able to participate in the activities that are happening? So what are we doing to make sure that people understand what's happening in the environment and are able to engage fully with it? They know what's happening, who's leading a particular session, if it's a conversation or a meeting, and are able to understand the flow of that particular session or meeting as well. Is there a timetable that can be provided for them to enable them to follow what's going on? And are we able to communicate appropriately? So if somebody uses signing or if they use symbols to be able to communicate, are we enabling those communication methods to be in place so that everybody can communicate fully and engage in all that we're doing? There's a lot to consider there, isn't there? We've looked at a range of different areas that the Equality Act 2010 provides for us, looking at direct discrimination, indirect discrimination. We've been looking at that reasonable adjustments area and the importance of that, and then this anticipatory duty in providing services. The Equality Act 2010 covers a wide range of different areas of life. It covers work, it covers education, it covers life as a consumer. It covers using public services, buying and renting property as a member or guest of a private club or association. There are a wide range of places and situations and environments where the Equality Act engages. Most of our life is spent in places where this applies. And so there is a duty for all of us to understand all of those areas of the Equality Act and think about what this means for us in our own context or environment. In our final video, we'll be exploring the 5 things that we can do to make sure that we are compliant with the legislation, with the Equality Act of 2010. And we'll be unpacking those 5 elements for you to then follow in your own context.